Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And comrade, it's been a while since we've gotten to talk. How you doing?
It's good. Life is good. The party has been supplying all of my needs, and I can't complain.
Excellent. Yes. Well, we're running into that time of the year in which some of the more brash elements of commodification of the sacred are certainly coming to the forefront as we approach Christmas.
That's right.
So I hope you enjoy some nice Hallmark movies and, go to some big box stores and buy lots of presents that were made by some poor people in a third world country and all that fun stuff.
Because if we don't do that, then Marx has already won.
That's right. We can't let it happen. It's a preemptive strike.
That's right. Well, listeners, as you can imagine, we're having fun here because Marxism it's a big thing, and it's in many ways the greatest distinguisher between worldviews of the developed nations. You have on the one hand, that's what the East-West divide, the Berlin Wall, in a sense was all about. Was about, is your vision for flourishing the capitalist vision, or is it the Marxist vision, which sharply critiques that capitalist vision? And so we're just, pre-inhabiting the text with our early banter here.
That's right. Yes, a foreshadow of what is to come.
If I may start, one of the things that I think this is big, major to my heart, because I think it was about a year ago, I was asked by Classical Academic Press to write a couple of introductions for a new reader they were writing on justice. So bringing together short passages from various great authors through the ages about justice and subdividing justice into various different sorts of justice, right? There's social justice and personal justice and distributive justice, which is economic, and all these sorts of things. And I got one of the ones I was assigned was the distributive justice one. And for that, they had some selections from Das Kapital. And I hadn't read Marx in a minute at that point. And I was reading it, and I grew up in the 80s. I knew, as everyone growing up in the 80s did, the way the world would end. It would end in nuclear war between Russia and the United States. I loved Red Dawn, and I like to imagine, how would I resist if we were invaded by Russia and China, and I had to, that movie is North Korea, right? And I had to fight and survive and stay off the grid and whatnot. So I was deeply catechized into the notion that communism, the big enemy of society and progress and all that is good, and freedom above all, right? Freedom. And so I was reading Das Kapital for this so that I could make my comments to this reader. And I had a strange experience. I was like, this makes a lot of sense. Like, I'm really resonating with what's going on here. And I'm kind of concerned about that. I don't know who I am anymore, right? And then I reached a certain point when I was like, oh no, stop the bus. I need to get off like as quickly as possible. This went very bad very quickly. And so I tell that story as a way of sort of by in a confessional mode, getting to this point, which is that as Westerners and as Americans, as I think most of our listeners are Americans, but as Westerners especially, it's hard to give Marx a fair read because we've decided out of hand that there's no way this happen, because if we let this happen, if we give any space for this, we're going to wind up with the Soviet Union, we're going to wind up with Red China and that sort of a thing. And what we want to suggest, at the very least as a thought experiment for the next hour or so, is that we suspend that conviction. And we say, let's just listen to what he's saying and see where that leads us when we aren't going into it with the notion that, no, this is obviously bankrupt from start to finish. And I think what will be helpful for that is a distinction we're going to make between Marxist critique and then Marx's recommendations. I should say Marx and Engels, their critique and their recommendation. So we'll try to be very clear about when we're on which side of that distinction, because we are more sympathetic with one than the other of those two projects. So that's just by a way of helping us to, this is what's required to give the text a proper read, because reading is an act of sympathy. And the moment you think, I can't even imagine why somebody would even want to think that, or this is ridiculous and no one should ever read this book, you put a ceiling on how much you can understand of it. So if we want to understand this text, which is a very challenging text for us, then we need to approach it differently.
Yes, and it's important to remember that the books in the canon aren't there because we agree with everything in them, but
Hmm.
rather they're there because they've so influenced the modern conversation and the way that we think, either negatively or positively, and so they do warrant a fair treatment, a fair hearing, and so it's important for us to do that. Just like we tried, well, you tried, I sort of did with Nietzsche, and and there have been others that we've looked at where we haven't been crazy about. I think back in the day when we did utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, there wasn't as much good stuff in there that we were crazy about, but it was still worth reading. And I think the same is true for Marx and Engels
Yeah,
as well.
deeply, deeply influential. In the same way, I'll have students read Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime by Kant, which
Hmm.
is possibly the single most racist and misogynist text I know. But it's really important because I think that it's very hard to understand a lot of the European attitudes during that colonial period without that backdrop. And so, yeah, there's at the very least there's a negative exemplum to be seen here. But I think also we're going to see that there's some stuff in this manifesto that is worth a second look.
Yes. In fact, I would say that the Communist Manifesto might be one of the most influential works in modernity.
Hmm.
Terry Eagleton, the leftist Catholic, points out that alienation, the commodification of social life, a culture of greed, aggression, mindless hedonism, and growing nihilism, the steady hemorrhage of meaning and value from human existence, it's hard to find an intelligent discussion of these questions that is not seriously indebted to the Marxist tradition.
Hmm.
So again, while we may not embrace the prescription, this is what we should do in the face of that, the observation of what's going on in our society is nevertheless something we should maybe at least listen to, and
Yeah.
we may be able to identify with. And I should say, those people who like to swim in sort of classical circles, if you've ever read Entertaining Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman or Technopoly by
Hmm.
Neil Postman, like he's very influenced by Marxist analysis, but like everybody loves Neil Postman. I mean, from serious thinkers to homeschool moms who are also serious thinkers. Everybody likes that book, and it's like, well, that is actually a lot of Marxist analysis kind of wrapped up in it.
Yeah.
It may
That's
help
right.
as we begin our conversation to talk a little bit about some of the historical context kind of behind the work. Unlike some of our other reads, this is maybe one of the more self-aware works in that it
Hmm.
is a pamphlet, and so it is engaging very explicitly with what's going on. But it's helpful to remember this was written over 175 years ago.
Hmm.
It was published in 1848. And because we're that far removed, almost 200 years removed, it's a little difficult, I think, to appreciate what time what the world was like for them. There are ways in which the world is very similar, but I think there are also a lot of ways in which it's very different. So you are in a context in which there's a ton of discontent among workers, which is fostered by radical economic inequality and
Hmm.
political oppression.
Hmm.
And this is in large part because the disparity between capital, that is the means of production, those who own the means of production, and labor, those who actually work in the factories and do the kind of grunt work, the wage
Hmm.
workers, was growing in a way because of the Industrial Revolution,
Hmm.
which really altered the fabric of European society. You go from a sort of feudalistic society to all of a sudden you have factories that are being employed in horrible conditions, by the way.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, children are working in the factories as well. There's not OSHA laws, there's not worker safety protocols, and so
Hmm.
and you're not making very much money. So things are just not good for workers in those conditions, and as a result, there were a lot of movements, attempts to organize the workforce through labor unions, and
Hmm.
you had solidarity movements, both Christian and non-Christian. You had socialist movements, and then you have this particular brand of socialism, which is sort of Marxist communism that comes to the fore during this time. So it's a very tumultuous time period.
Yeah.
We think of Europe now, and we think, I mean, it's kind of everything's kind of stable. I mean, there are some things here and there, but overall, it's uh, people take a lot of siestas and all that kind of stuff. But it's back then, this is not the case.
Yeah. Although these days, I mean, France is falling apart, and
Well, that's
there's
true.
a lot of trouble over there. But this is, I think it's a really great point, and a good way to get into that in my mind, and imaginatively, is a Dickens novel. Take a Dickens novel set in the city, like an Oliver Twist or something like that, and you get it's depicting that industrial society.
Or in some ways, maybe not exactly with the industrial aspect, but like even an American movie like It's a Wonderful Life
Mm,
is, I mean, you look at the way that it's so hard for even just a normal family in the town to acquire housing. And that's what the
yeah,
building and loan is there for, because, the Potter Bank is so corrupt, and it's so hard to get funding for housing and stuff like that. And
yeah,
so the building and loan steps in and kind of fills a communal need. In some ways, it's a sort of socialist scheme.
yeah.
Not to
It's
ruin anybody's
fascinating.
Christmas by saying It's a Wonderful Life is a socialist movie, but
Well, and there's one of the, I remember hearing a description of a typical factory worker's day, and it just in England during the Industrial Revolution, and it just blew me away. Whether as it was described, I don't remember where I encountered this. They might have to walk between 3 and 5 miles to get to the factory in the morning, and so because of that, they would leave home at 3 or 4 in the morning, and walk for a few hours to get to the factory by opening. And then they would work all day. They'd work a long, long shift, with just the briefest of breaks for lunch. And then at the end of the day, they'd have to walk all that way back home, arriving home between 10 o'clock and midnight.
hmm,
And then eating a quick meal, going to bed to get that 3 hours of sleep to get up and do it again the next day. And they're doing this 6 days out of the week, right? I mean, you're not seeing your family at all. It's a brutal, brutal way to live. And reason we call things revolutions, guys, this is really important, because when you talk about communism, you're going to talk about revolution, and we're talking here about the Industrial Revolution, which was actually, it was the revolution that gave rise to communism. You call something a revolution because it's a major upheaval in society. The Industrial Revolution is not just, oh wow, we're able to create all this new stuff, no, it means that all sectors of life are being touched by this thing, that millions and millions of people's lives look different on the other side of this revolution than they looked on the earlier side of it. And most of us, I would say, have lived through a technological revolution. And so, those of us who are above, say, the age of 30 can look back on the world of our childhood and compare it to the world of today and recognize that, wow, it's a very, very different place. The
mhm.
types of things that my kids are thinking about, dealing with, aware of, what they think is possible and impossible is radically different than what I thought when I was a child. That's the type of thing you have to keep in mind, both in terms of what's giving rise to this. The Industrial Revolution was such a major, um, influence in culture, and such a major negative influence in the lives of so many in culture, that it called absolutely for some sort of response. The
Mhm.
question is, what type of response? And this is one instance of a kind of response. And so, again, even if you don't like this response, I think it's important to recognize that some response was called for.
Yeah, just like anything, progress in the progress, we'll call it,
Hmm.
uh, and the same is true of the technological revolution. They all have dark undersides.
Yeah.
And so it's important, even sort of beside the question of how you orient yourself towards the actual revolution that's occurring, um, to at least listen to voices that might not share the same perspective of that revolution that you do. So, many of us benefit greatly from the technological revolution, and there are many positives you could point to. But at the same time, you can look at the way that third world communities are exploited as we dump, toxic technology products, on to the in their land. And you can also look at, gig workers, for example, Uber drivers, DoorDash workers, and things, and like the kind of things they have to do. Most of us don't do that kind of work. We don't see it. It's not very visible to us.
Mhm.
The DoorDasher leaves the food before you even have a chance to interact with them. So you just don't talk to them. You don't see them. They're kind of invisible to us. And so it's important to listen to different voices. And I think the same thing's true about the Industrial Revolution. It's kind of like when you read, like when we read some of the Enlightenment philosophers we've read, and we think, oh, this makes me a little uncomfortable, the way they're talking about tradition in the past. And then it's like, yeah, but you think about what they had to put up with
Mhm.
Like, I don't love the French Revolution, but it's not like it just came out of nowhere. It's not
Yeah.
like that people just woke up one day on the wrong side of the bed. It's like there were things that were acting that pushed that
That's
forward.
right.
And
That's
the
right.
same is true of Marx and Engels as well. They were sort of reacting to what was in front of them. And I think it's maybe important to say a quick biographical note about Marx and Engels,
Mm.
because most people have heard of Marx. Engels, maybe not so much, except for if you buy a copy of the book, his name's always on it. They were a pair, they were a partnership, German philosophers, political theorists. They worked together quite a bit in their careers. Marx was sort of the more abstract one who provided the theoretical framework, and Engels was a bit more into the practical examples. Um, Engels was also wealthy. He was
Mm.
the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer, so he saw this industrial revolution stuff from certainly from a particular angle, and he supported Marx for most of their working life, and
Mm.
took care of his family after Marx passed away. So together they wrote a number of works, not just the Communist Manifesto. They wrote their first work together was called The Holy Family, which was a critique of the young Hegelians, which was a
Mm.
group of German intellectuals who tried to carry on the dialectical method of thesis, uh, uh, antithesis, and synthesis.
Mm.
Um, and they were the young Hegelians were often critical of religion, so
Mm.
they were fronted by Feuerbach, and they insisted that theology is really just an exercise in anthropology, that there is nothing really true about religion; it just tells us about ourselves. They were political radicals. They did often advocate for equality and democracy. And Marx and Engels actually started as kind of friendly with this group, but as they kind of developed, both groups developed, there became a growing divide. And so the Marxist critique became that the young Hegelians were too focused on the abstract rather than the material
Mm.
conditions and class struggle.
Mhm.
Then they wrote another book together called The German Ideology, which continued that same line of argumentation, critiquing ideology, historical ideology, as a kind of, critiquing ideology as a kind of historical idealism
Mm.
in favor of historical materialism. So
Mhm.
idealism is the movement that sees ideas and consciousness and intellectual progress as the driving force of history, morality, and culture. So it looks heavily at the development of an idea and
Mhm.
traces that idea throughout history. So a good example of this, if you've ever looked at or are familiar with Hegel at all, his view of history as the progression of the world spirit is sort of
Right.
a idealist move. Whereas materialism says, actually, it's not the history of ideas that kind of drives everything. It's the material conditions, it's the economic
Mhm.
structures, it's the class struggle that drives history. And so its focus isn't on abstract things, but on concrete realities like labor and production and wealth distribution, looking at the resolution of material and economic contradictions.
Mhm.
So, a good example of this is how Marx's view of history is that it's class struggle, which ultimately leads us to communism.
Yeah.
After this book, Marx writes his 3-volume Das Kapital, which is sort of the magnum opus, though it's not all published during his life. Volume 3, I think in particular, was put together after his death by
Mm.
Engels, so it's kind of hard to follow. But the first one is coherent. And this is where he really does kind of apply his historical materialism to explain modern society. Also, I'm a little bit of a Civil War American history buff. Marx has some really great essays on the American Civil War, which is really
Mm.
interesting kind of
Oh, I hadn't seen
analysis
those.
of. Yeah, no, they're really interesting. They're really good, actually.
I mean, I
Um,
think what Marx is really great at is analyzing, things that critique in that broad sense. He's so sharp at that.
yes, yes.
There's a I think what you just said there is really helpful in one sense. Loads of what you said there was really helpful. This is really, really good background information. This idealism thing, which
Mhm.
is, I mean, that's what it's Hegel's all about. His main work is the phenomenology of spirit, which is all about the unfolding of the world soul throughout history and whatnot. History is just the phenomenological appearing of a real development that's happening somewhere other than the material realm, and that's all very, whether you think of it as pie in the sky or as mud in the sky, depending on how excited you are about his vision. um, the Marxists are much more. There's like you're such a Platonist, right? You're always talking about this stuff. We need to be Aristotelians and talk about what's actually happening right here. One of the aspects of Marxism that's very forefront because of the way that it was deployed in the 20th century is the atheism of it, and specifically the anti-religious character of it. And that is deeply tied to the choice of the materialist over the idealist orientation, because religion teaches you that your material conditions are not ultimate. They aren't the place where you look for meaning, but you look beyond your material conditions for meaning in something greater than the material realm. And that's, to Marx, if you let that in, you've given the whole game over to the Hegelians already, right? I mean, there's good luck trying to get a social movement going to change the material structures. And this is something we have seen, that social justice is often viewed with extreme skepticism by certain Christians, in part because of the ways it has been tied with or become a slippery slope to more liberal approaches to things in general. But it remains a strange contradiction for the followers of Christ to be slow to recognize the need to come alongside the poor. When he preaches that so consistently and so regularly in the Gospels. And so this is these tensions are right there. This is an important aspect of, Marxism is very reactionary, and there's an important aspect of we can't let this thing in, otherwise all this other stuff's going to come into.
Yeah, so maybe one exercise to kind of demonstrate the tension here. I just read. Have you ever read the book Civil War as Theological Crisis
No.
by Mark Knoll?
Mm-mm.
It's a really interesting look at sort of the preaching in both the South and the North leading up to and during the Civil War. And both sides, or pastors on both sides, were very convinced that the Bible was clear and it supported their position. So the Northerners found ways to be abolitionists based on the scriptural text. The Southerners found all sorts of proof texts to defend enslaving human beings. And so they were just doing what God had ordained, And so the Hegelian might look at that discussion as really informing the war, whereas a Marxist would say that discussion flows out of the economic and social arrangements that were present both in North and South. So in the South, you had this kind of patriarchal, agrarian, racial system of hierarchy. In the North, you had kind of started to do away with some of that. And so based on those conditions, they come to the text with entirely different worldviews, or they use the text differently. And so that would be one way to delineate the two approaches, I think.
Nice.
And there may be some truth in both of those things. I mean, it's certainly true that someone who's raised in a particular system will more readily see that system elsewhere. But it doesn't. I don't know that I would go as far as Marx and say everything is reducible to that either.
Right.
There were Southerners who were able to decide that was a completely unnatural system and oppose it. So it's certainly maybe again some truth there, but maybe not completely correct either.
Well, as long as we're talking about it theologically, I mean, in a sense, what you have here is in this argument, it's a false duality,
right,
between spirit and body, and the Christian religion is dualistic. It says that you have to have both body and soul together. And so the Hegelians are wrong because they don't recognize embodiment, and the Marxists are wrong because they don't recognize spiritual realities. And so but they're both also right to some extent, because there is body, because there is spirit, right? And so choosing a side in that's what causes you to lose, because you're shutting off half of existence, right? Or at least half of human existence. Human dynamics are always going to be a combination of physical and spiritual.
Yes. So the book that we're talking about today, or really we should call it maybe a pamphlet more than a book, is the Communist Manifesto, which was published before Das Kapital. So it's not maybe as thorough. Its purpose really is to draw attention to communism as a global movement and to present sort of the goals of communism and counter some misconceptions about it. But it's meant as a rallying cry. I mean, that's the end of it. Workers of the world unite, and all that. So it's very important to it. So maybe we could just kind of do a brief overview of kind of what is going on in the text, and then we
Mm.
can talk about some more of the theoretical questions that surround it. So the opening of the book traces the bourgeois and the proletarians. So the bourgeois refers to those who control production. So the bourgeois are the factory owners, versus the proletarians, who are the ones who work in the factories, the wage laborers. And so this chapter is really about class struggle
Hmm.
and tracing out the dynamics of capitalism and sort of tracing how it got to where we are.
Yeah.
So for Marx, every society has always been characterized by class struggle,
Hmm.
but those classes were different. So maybe it was enslaved people versus free people, or
Hmm.
maybe it was lord versus serf,
Hmm.
or but now it's bourgeois and proletariat. So the modern capitalist system is actually fairly simplified. It's collapsed down into bourgeois proletarians.
And that's one thing that's really helpful, that helps me, because it took me a long time to understand who the bourgeoisie were when I was first learning this as a younger person. And it's because I wasn't reading this. Actually, it's really helpful if you read this to see what's going on. And another way to think about it is the upper class were the nobility. They weren't the rich, they were the nobility. It doesn't matter how rich you were never going to be upper class if you didn't have a title to your name. And the lower class were the combination of serfs and slaves. And serfs are servants who have a contract, right? They have protections. They have a hereditary right to work this land through their family in perpetuity. They have given up their freedom to be in the servitude and the freedom of their children in order to secure access to a place to live and work for forever. So they've got protections on them. We think of serfdom as a negative thing, but it was a contract that people entered into willingly because it had clear advantages for them and for their families. And then and that was what you had originally. If we're looking at Europe, sort of post-Roman Empire Europe, that's kind of what you had. And then you get the rise of this merchant class and artisan class and guild class, who are folks who were skilled at something particular or who are doing the trade, and they fall in the middle. And so they're the middle class by being neither the nobles or the serfs. The middle class became the bourgeoisie. And
Yep.
that's why that word is derived from burgher, which is someone who lives in a bourg, a city. And the upper class gets wiped off by various revolutions, French Revolution and things like that. So the upper class is essentially done away with, and then the lower class is transformed into the proletariat. And so someone like Elon Musk or Donald Trump, who are wildly and insanely rich, nevertheless are bourgeois. They're workers, they're artisans, they're merchants, right? There's no nobility in the proper sense about them, and that's the squishing down of everything into: are you on the controlling mercantile end of this, or are you the ways by which that is going forward?
Yeah, there's a shift from a sort of aristocracy to, I mean, I use this word hesitantly, but a sort of meritocracy. The middle
Mm,
class are those who made it.
mhm.
They were self-made
Yeah,
versus just inheriting titles, wealth, and land, because however many generations back, someone conquered
yeah.
someone or whatever. Um,
And that's what
which of
allows for
course,
social mobility, because
right,
as long as the top level is noble status, you can't break in.
that's right.
But once it's about, have you succeeded in gaining capital, then anyone can get there.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Um, so capitalism, then, this system where it's bourgeois and proletariat, Marx would argue has created unprecedented technological and economic advancement, but it also deepens exploitation and inequality.
Mm,
So, uh, a lord who has serfs, um, there should be, at least when that system was working at its best, a kind of paternalism that exists between lord and serf,
mhm.
where he should want to take care of the serfs because the serfs are what allow him to have the privileges that he has. And also, if he were to overstep his bounds, if he were to treat them really terribly, there's always the risk that they revolt and kill him. And so, there's certain safeguards, there's certain aspects of that arrangement that allow for a kind of a space for being human,
Mm.
maybe we could say.
One of the things that I found really helpful in some medieval historians about this relationship is that in the Middle Ages, land was relatively plenteous and workers were relatively few.
Yeah.
And so the reason the Lord would want to enter into the serfdom contract is that it ensures him laborers for the land, which he has to do that in order to meet his quotas with his feudal lord and stuff. And so the question of who you're going to marry, like it's like very exciting for the feudal lord when your serfs get married, because that means you're going to have another generation of workers on that land. You don't want to have to find somebody to replace them.
Mhm. Versus in a factory arrangement where if I hire you at minimum wage, you might be a really good worker, but I don't want to give you a raise.
Yeah, that's right.
In fact, if you start demanding more money, I'm going to go try and find a person who will do the same amount of work, or at least enough work for me to be profitable for as little money as I possibly can give them.
That's right.
And so that is one of the big shifts, I think, for Marx, that he's identifying as creating a system of exploitation and inequality. And so this leaves workers alienated,
Mm,
right? It leaves them exploited. It subjects them to harsh conditions. They're distant from the work that they're producing. If you, as a serf, maybe you're a farmer, and so you're harvesting crops and you're bringing them to the Lord, but those crops are then distributed to the serfs who live in the town that you occupy or the surrounding area that you occupy, and so your work is kind of directly going into the stockpile, which is then feeding everyone. But when you work on an assembly line making Ford cars, you may not even own a Ford car because you
yeah,
can't afford it. And
yeah.
all you're doing is just screwing a lug nut into this wheel over and over and over again all day, every day. That's what you do for, well, 40 hours a week now, but back then probably much longer than that.
Yeah, 80.
And and so you have no ownership in your work. What
Mhm.
you're producing for someone else. You're
Yeah.
literally a cog in a machine, and so you feel distant from the thing you're creating.
One of the things that never made any sense to me as a young man trying to figure out what to do with my life was to spend my life making money for somebody else,
Right.
right? Like, if the work that I'm a banker and my job is to do this so that the bank makes more money, so that the owners of the bank, yeah, it's like, what's meaningful about that, right? I want to do something. Listeners, please don't hear me as saying that your life is meaningless if you're a banker. This was just what I was thinking as a young man. I wanted my work to put something into the world that was meaningful rather than simply helping somebody else get rich, right? Because I knew I wasn't going to be getting rich.
Right.
I would make, hopefully, what I needed to keep my family fed and clothed and housed. But the better I did my work, the better the bank did, the richer the owners of the bank and the stakeholders of the bank would become. But as a non-stakeholder, the ceiling to what I'm going to make is set. I know exactly what I'm going to get. And that's I become capital for the bank. My work becomes capital for the bank. Right.
Yes.
And that is so, when had knowing nothing about Marx, I had this vision of, wait, what's that for? That feels like the epitome of meaninglessness to me is,
Mhm.
I'm just going to keep running in circles so somebody else can progress.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, I mean, we should say the reason, I mean, this system may be able to work in some ways that aren't as dire as Marx always paints it out to be, because, not all work is dreary factory work.
Yeah.
Um, and so it may be that you can do something that you do enjoy, and that a company can offer you a sort of stable way to do that thing that you enjoy.
Hmm.
And yeah, you're creating value for them, but they're able to make sure you survive, and give you the opportunity to do something you like doing.
Yeah.
So it may be that, like you said, it's not that everybody who works for a company is necessarily feeling the same way about it as you just articulated there, but that would be sort of the ideal version of this, right? Is that
Yeah.
you're actually able to do something you enjoy, and the company is
Yeah.
willing to, well, I mean, you think about even the way, I mean, again, I think we've lived through a lot of change over the past couple generations. I mean, you think about, I mean, there a lot of the older folks at my church were able to work for one company their whole lives, and that
Yeah.
company took good care of their employees and had great benefits. And but now, you go work for the same company, and maybe you're there for a few years, and the benefits maybe aren't as good as they used to be, and
Yeah.
so it's tough.
And that's kind of, and that's exactly in line with Marx's critique, is that the shift that's happened between the greatest generation and ours is that employers have stopped looking at employees as a part of the family,
Right.
and started looking at them as interchangeable parts. And so you could drop it. It's the factorization of the office job. But to play America's advocate for a second here, I mean, we enjoy such a high standard of living in America because the work of the bankers who are, quote unquote, just making money for somebody else has raised the entire economy to the point where across the board, most Americans enjoy a standard of living unheard of outside of the halls of the richest kings in previous ages of human history.
Yes. So the proletariat for Marx is getting bigger because of
Mm,
this inequality, this imbalance. The
mhm,
bourgeois is getting smaller and wealth concentrates in the hands of fewer people. And so
mhm,
for Marx, these two opposed trajectories eventually converge in a proletarian revolution in which capitalism is overthrown and a classless society is reached. In some ways, you can think about this revolution as a kind of supernaturalized Christian eschatology,
mm,
that everything kind of converges at some point, that some big tumult happens, the wealthy are driven away, and all of a sudden, we have a classless society.
yeah.
Um, so that's kind of the first section of the book. The second section of the book looks at the role of communists. It makes a critique of capitalism and it advocates for the abolition of private property. Now, that's a big one that people latch onto. They hear that and they automatically sort of turn off. So we'll talk about what that means in just a second. But communists, according to Marx, align with the proletariat, but they're not necessarily the same thing as the proletariat, because the communist is someone who has their eyes open to this larger system,
Mm,
and they focus a lot on sort of the idea of international solidarity. They focus on this idea of historical materialism, so they want to contextualize the present in terms of historical trends and things like that. So
yeah.
the stated goal for Marx of communism is to abolish private property. Now, when
Mhm.
they say private property, they do not mean personal possessions.
Right.
What they mean is capital. They want to eliminate capital so as to end the exploitation of labor and the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few. So, what this could look like is that, if I own a factory and I pay you to do work for me, rather than this arrangement happening, the factory's taken away from me and it's given to the workers.
Mhm.
And so everybody who works there owns part of the factory. And this,
Yeah.
of course, can look differently depending on different places. How exactly that's divvied up, but basically, that's the idea: is that there's a kind of corporate, or well, yeah, literally corporate ownership of the factory. That me and
Mhm.
you are both. It's almost like a co-op, right? Like
Yeah.
me and you are both the CEOs of this company.
That's right. And if I recall correctly, I think it was Adam Smith who really insisted that a worker has a right to a share in what they
Hmm.
produce, right? And
Yeah.
this is really just building on that principle to say, if you're going to put all this labor, all this capital in, then you should have a stake in it. Everyone should be a stakeholder.
Now, to some people, this might sound really scary because you're thinking,
Mhm.
what about property? What about family? What about individuality? And what about culture?
Yeah.
Don't worry. For Marx and Engels, these things are already compromised under capitalism, anyways. And so
Good
if
news,
we free,
everyone.
so if we free ourselves from this system, then we can still have those things, but we'll have them. Maybe our orientation towards those things will change in a
Yeah.
positive way. Is sort
Yeah.
of the pitch that they're selling. And so the stated goal of communism becomes the seizure of political power by the proletariat and the transformation of society through a kind of socialism.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's funny that the seizure of political power, because the line of argumentation you laid out just then would lead to the conclusion the seizure of the means of production,
mhm.
not the seizure of political power. However, the missing step is one that is pretty intuitive, which is that you cannot separate political power from the means of production. right?
Right.
The means of production are going to, political power will follow the means of production, because political power is ultimately a pathway to wealth and having the freedom you desire. And so, we see this in if you look at two very different nations, right? Russia, which is built on communism, and the United States, which is built on capitalism, both places have a problem with oligarchies. We have a problem with rich people who are exercising undue political authorities, right? I mean, so to pick the example of Elon Musk, in Trump's presidency hasn't even started yet, and here we have this guy who has no elected position. He does have an appointed position, but no elected position, who seems to be the president's chief advisor right now, and setting, poised to set policy for the country going forward, because he's the wealthiest man in the world.
I actually saw, I think he tweeted just the other day about this, that people keep using this term oligarchy, and he was like, basically, well, let's just cut out the middleman. I mean, since we all know it's real, let's
It's really just us anyway.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's certainly true. And I mean, you just look at on both sides, who gives money to major political candidates, and it's usually corporations and wealthy donors. I mean, certainly you and I could throw 10 or 15 bucks towards our preferred candidate, but that's just a drop in the bucket compared to the large swaths of funds that get donated by corporate interest and by wealthier people. So from there, Marx and Engels critique, in the third chapter of Communist Manifesto, they critique other socialist and communist movements. So because of the conditions being so bad in the 1800s, it's not as though Marx and Engels sort of woke up one day and said, hey, everybody, we have this totally new idea that nobody else has ever thought of. But rather, there were a lot of movements that existed, and socialist experiments and advocates for socialism were a thing already. Marx and Engels offer a particular vision of what that is. And so they're against kind of a few different kinds of socialism. They're against reactionary socialism, which is a sort of feudal socialism, and petty
Are you saying
bourgeois.
feudal or futile?
Feudal, like this. Yeah, right. Well, right. From them, the corporate wants you to see the difference between these two pictures. So both of those, the problem with feudal socialism and petty bourgeois socialism is that they try to restore or maintain old systems of privilege. Hey, let's just go back to the way things were before this middle class arose and created the bourgeois. There was also conservative or bourgeois socialism, which advocated for reforming capitalism rather than its abolition. I think probably most Americans would be for one of those. Most Americans who would identify as socialists would be for one of those systems. Let's just reform capitalism kind of from the inside. And, I mean, in some ways, these kind of movements have had a good impact on the American worker. The fact that we have various laws about labor and everything. I mean, that kind of is what is the fruit of this system.
Yeah.
But for Marx and Engels, it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't get rid of the bourgeois. It just puts a kind of smiling face on tyranny. And then finally, there another movement, which I think is one of the more interesting ones, is utopian socialism, which was very idealistic and very disconnected from the actual realities of class struggle and material condition. And so they're against all of these systems. They want something that will overthrow the bourgeois and empower the proletariat, rather than sort of maintaining the status quo in a way that might be slightly more slightly nicer.
Yeah. One of the things, this is a stat from the St. Louis Federal Bank, the Fed, speaking of 2024, the second quarter 2024, so through June 30th. There's two stats about wealth inequality, and people tend to focus on the first one, but it's the second one that's actually really telling in terms of this, thinking about the relationship of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and how the proletariat is growing. The top 10% of U.S. households control 67% of total household wealth. That's the one people focus on. But look at this other one is way more astounding. The bottom 50% of households have 2.5% of the total wealth. So half of Americans have less than 3% of the total wealth of the country. That's your proletariat. That's what you see how big that is compared to the top 10%. Those are your capitalists, right? I mean, those are the great captains of industry. 10% 10% to 50%, and you see that number swaying and swaying and growing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That type of wealth distribution is what communism exists. Communism comes out of naming that, calling that out, and it exists to try to do something about that.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point that you made a moment ago, that is easily forgotten when you come to this text. This is not a text that aims to found communism. This is not the founding document of communism. Communism was a thriving movement, and out of that, there was a need felt to have a text like this. Just the opening of the text says it very, very well. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. One, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. Two, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. That's what this is, right? We've been doing this for long enough that everybody's afraid of us, and everyone there's all this misinformation about who we are and what we think and whatnot. So it's time for us to step forward and make our declaration of who we are.
Yes. Yes. So the work, and that's how it concludes, right? Is the work is looking at where do we go from here, in which the emphasis is on creating alliances among communists to support any movement that would advance the interests of the proletariat and work towards a kind of international solidarity among workers, with that end view of overthrowing capitalism, which is where the call to action comes into play, right? Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
Yeah. It's also great rhetoric when one has to say, like, that's
absolutely,
that's really cool.
It is. Oh yes, it's like, sign me up. Oh wait, what am I signing up for? So there is well, let me frame it this way. The conversation has evolved a lot since Marx, because we've got 200 years of developments that have occurred. And so you often find distinctions and things that are made now that would have been interesting or are maybe anachronistic reading them back into Marx. So for example, when I was in undergrad and was sort of, reading Marx for the first time, you would often hear people say, usually other college students, that communism and socialism aren't the same thing. That socialism means redistribution of wealth, and communism means the workers control the means of production. And so therefore, communism's never been tried, and it's not the same thing as socialism. That may be true in our modern parlance, but for Marx, he doesn't see communism as a separate thing. It is a variant of socialism, and then he's arguing for an even more specific kind of communism that it distinguishes itself from other forms of communism. So it's just important to remember that for Marx, communism is a way of being socialist. So it's a movement within a larger movement. It's not it's not really a distinct thing.
Yeah, this has been one of the areas that has been most subject to confusion in our country. During the McCarthyism era, when you could be ruined for being thought to be a communist, being the accusation of communism. In the 60s, all the academics were communists because they saw the Marxian critique. See, that's really what they were. They weren't really communists. They were Marxists in the sense of, we think that this critique really, really holds of our society. And that was, people lost jobs and people lost tenure and that sort of a thing over that type of a situation. And what was at heart of that was McCarthy coming in and saying, look, if it's socialist, it's communist. And if it's communist, it's red, it's Russian. And so you sort of plaster over all of that. So a lot of what, people were saying in the universities when we were younger was trying to recover from that and get their legs under them a little bit and say, we may be agreed that communism is bad, but that shouldn't mean that all socialism is bad. We shouldn't lump them all together like that, which I think is absolutely true.
Yes.
But it's also important to say that, for Marx, what mattered was we need to be socialists, and this is the way to be socialist. This is how it has to happen, because any way short of this is going to collapse back into capitalism.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't go all the way to seizing the means of production and political power, then the self-interest is always going to drive people to capitalism. There's a section I want to read from the first part that I think is really, really spot on, and also a bit there's a couple parts of this first part especially that are so eerily contemporary. Here he's talking about the bourgeoisie, and he says, historically, the bourgeoisie has played a most revolutionary point. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his quote-unquote natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, none of which Marx is recommending we want back, by the way. He's just saying these are historical things that they've conquered, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom: free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, which is what he says we had before, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Right? So this is really, if you don't touch all of those areas, if you leave any bit of that self-interest in place in the relations between man and man, it will grow like a cancer, unseat communism, and restore capitalism.
Right. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the prescription and description aspect of this conversation that we alluded to earlier. What are some things that we can commend the sort of Marxist analysis for? And then where are some ways in which we would say, maybe that goes a little too far or isn't quite right?
So I'm going to read a little bit more from just a couple of paragraphs on, where he's still describing how the bourgeoisie has come into power. And he says, all old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In the place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In the place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production, the intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. Now, when you think about this, old established industries are destroyed and replaced by new industries whose introduction becomes a life or death question for civilized nations. Simple example, bookstores. Right? The local bookstore where you knew the guy and he could get anything for, and you'd go in to see what the new treasures were and whatnot, had been replaced by Amazon, which was originally just an online bookstore. That's the first thing they sold. And now imagine your life without Amazon. Right? I'm gonna just be very transparent here, because it's the end of the year and my Amazon account shows, you saved this much with Prime this year. I've saved over $780 in shipping costs this year. Tells you how dependent I've become on Prime. It becomes a life or death question. Can you live without your smartphone? That's a new industry, the production of smartphones. And what does it require? It requires nickel from China, and it requires all these other things happening in various places, that global commerce they're talking about. You're not free to walk back from these things. And when I go to France and when I go to Africa, they're using the same phones.
Mm-hmm.
They're wearing the same clothes, right? The products are they're driving the same cars. The number of different cars available in the world has reduced drastically from what it was at its height to now, because increasingly smaller national car producers are just getting pushed out by the exports from America and Britain and things like that, right? That's what he's describing, is this transformation of the global landscape, which has not become any less since this treatise was written. It's only accelerated.
And, to kind of go back to the class struggle aspect of it, you can also look at what a company like Amazon does. So not only have they flattened sort of industry, but you can also look at how they treat their employees,
Yeah.
which is not good.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that gets released about how the conditions in their warehouses and stuff, it's not a very good thing. Drivers, have the software that keeps track of their productivity and all this kind of stuff. So that's not good. And then even I think as we're recording this, I haven't kept up with it super closely, but I know there's some attempts to unionize. So the workers want to organize in order to demand certain things in return for their labor. And the company, of course, is fighting very strongly against the organization of labor.
Yeah.
And so, it raises some really interesting questions, like, are we okay with maybe paying a little bit more per package, maybe saving, $400 instead of $700 a year, because, maybe the Amazon employees need to make more money, to make livable wages and have better benefits and things like that. It's one of those interesting questions. And there's of course a theoretical component, and then there's a pragmatic component where, theoretically, I think we'd all say we'd love to see people make more money, but we also don't want it to affect our bottom line very much either. And
Yeah.
so this is one of the, I think, things that Marx points out that is good to remember, is that the economy is interconnected and that there are these dynamics at play. And so economics aren't just abstract questions. They aren't just questions that are unconnected to ethics, but rather economics is a form of ethical arrangement
Yeah.
when it comes to our social organization. And so, that we should think a little bit more about how we engage in these things. Of course, that's difficult. Sometimes it's a little more expensive, but it is important that we at least ask the questions and try to get a better handle on the current economic systems that we
Yeah.
engage in.
Yeah, I was reading an article by a Yale economist just this week, and he was this particular nature of his research is on social systems of economic changes, and he's
Mm,
particularly focused on um, labor realignment and job creation and loss and that sort of a thing. And what he was considering in this article is um, what the impact of mechanization is on global job markets. And I said mechanization because it's on the one hand robots doing human jobs, and it's on the other hand AI, which is going to start handing over even more human jobs, taking over even more human jobs. And it's become very common in certain intellectual circles to hear about the exploitation of third world workers. That these people are working long factory hours under industrial revolution type conditions and being paid a pittance, not a living wage, because their country has no laws protecting them. They don't have minimum wage laws and that sort of a thing. And so folks say, well, yes, you have to divest yourself, right? You don't want to buy clothes from Nike because they're all made in sweatshops and this sort of a thing. And there's, one of the questions that I've always thought was very important to ask in that whole question is, okay, so this person isn't making a living wage, but what are they going to do when you divest? And so then Nike closes down that factory and they lose their job. What have we actually made their life better? Because now they don't have a job at all. And when you go to some of these places like Haiti, you see, well, okay, so a lot of these people are like, well, we can't eat today. Hopefully we can eat tomorrow. Whereas the ones in the exploitative jobs are like, no, we definitely can eat 5 or 6 times a week. We can be pretty confident about that, right? It's not to say that the sweatshops are good or right, but it's to say that getting the sweatshops closed down and doing nothing else doesn't leave the people who work there in a better situation. And this guy was pointing out, he says, and this I thought this was fascinating coming from a Yale economist, that the mechanization is going to close down a lot of those places because it will now be as cheap or cheaper to have machines do it here than to do it there. And even if the machines only do it for the same cost of the workers doing it in Haiti, now you don't have to ship from Haiti back to the United States to get to your market. And so you're saving money. So a lot of that labor that's been outsourced is going to be brought back in, but not given to humans, given to machines. And this is what I thought was interesting from a Marxist perspective. He says this is going to have a devastating effect on the economies of those nations, because those nations have been experiencing economic growth as a result of the factories being there, even though the factories are sweatshops, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be undercut when this comes out. And this is that whole situation. I'm not saying that any part of that situation is right or whatever, but that whole situation is what Marx is critiquing. The whole fact that you have these factories that are money producing machines. Yeah, there's a middleman. They make a product and the product makes money, but it's really the capital. You're really just increasing capital. That we see how it enslaves people who come under its sway when we put the sweatshops there. And then we see how they become so dependent on their enslavement that you can't even ethically take the sweatshop away without making their lives worse and dissolving them into starvation. And so I think this is a very, very subtle problem. Sweatshops are a problem. Child labor is a problem. And the solution is not as simple as stop it. Right? It's got to be more holistic than that. It's sort of, you've gone in and gotten entangled with these foreign economies. Now to ethically divest yourself means leaving something behind that's going to cost you. It's going to cost you significantly. Are we as Americans willing to have, in the wake of all this inflation we've been seeing since the pandemic, are we willing to have the prices of things, let's get outrageous, doubled, so that people in other countries can have lives that are still not much less than our lives, not bringing them up to equal status at all, just helping them come a little bit out of subsistence and starvation, right? It's hard to assent to that when we don't see how we could make that work financially. How in the world is $50,000 a year not enough money for a family to live on when most of the families in the world are living on a tenth of that or less? Because of the one-upmanship of capitalism. Marx describes this really well. You keep creating new desires and new markets, and everything keeps ratcheting up. And yes, that raises the standard of living, but it also raises the cost of living to where we can't imagine how we could even survive as 10 times what others are living under in the world. I think these are very urgent questions. And that's why when I read this, I'm like, gosh, I kind of feel like we need to read more Marx, right? But on the other hand, I feel like we need a really strong delineation. Burning down the churches and having the revolution and overthrowing the government, I don't think that's the answer. That has not been historically awesome.
Yeah. In fact, that actually leads us to a question that one of our listeners posed in the chat. So if you support the podcast, you can join our chat, and I usually try to ask if anybody has any questions about works. And sometimes people don't really have any actual specific questions. They just want to hear us talk about the book. But with Marx, we got a couple questions, and they're all really good. And so Michael on Substack asks, why did Marx consider Christianity to be the opium of the masses, which ties into Junius's point there. Now, you have probably heard that quote of Marx that he calls religion the opium of the masses. That quotation comes from, not from this work, not even from Das Kapital, from a work probably nobody who quotes it has really read, called A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, which was published in 1844. And I'm going to read the entire quote because I think it's interesting. And actually, I think it's a bit more tender than people often think it is when they read it. So here's what he says. The foundation of irreligious criticism is man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Religion is indeed the self-conscious and self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. But no man is but man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, state, society. This state and society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world, because they are an inverted world. Religion is the general theory of this world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in popular form, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, and its universal basis of consolation and justification. It is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. The struggle against religion is, therefore, indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call them to give up a condition that requires illusion. The criticism of religion is, therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Now, as theologians, I think there's a lot that we would push back on in that. But let me give you an illustration from another great book that we should probably do someday, which is Animal Farm. And in Animal Farm, which is, of course, a retelling of the rise of the Soviet Union using farm animals, there is one character, I think it's the crow, right? And the crow is always flying off and never around when the other animals need him to be there. And when he is there, he's always promising them Candy Mountain. All we have to do is just go to Candy Mountain. And Candy Mountain is, maybe we won't get it until after we die, but it'll be so worth all this present suffering. What the crow represents in Orwell's book is the Orthodox Church, which stood off to the side as the USSR was sort of becoming a thing. And even though the USSR was anti-church, the Orthodox, a lot of the Russian church became a kind of state apparatus rather than an actual prophetic voice against the oppressive.
They got grandfathered in because they were Russian and they were native, right. And so they got an exception to the harsh communism.
Yes, and even today, right? You see, with the various inter-Orthodox disputes between Ukraine and Russia, the Russian church is kind of just a vehicle for the Putin regime to do whatever they want to do. And so that's, I think, what really Marx is being critical of, is that religion should make us uncomfortable, but often it's used as a kind of way of just extending our cultural systems. The church becomes part of those systems and gets kind of assimilated into it, and it loses some of its prophetic voice. So like you see that leading up to the Civil War, you see Southern pastors preaching sermons about how slavery is actually a God-ordained system and that we have to preserve it at all costs. And, that's not true.
Yeah.
Thank
you for saying that. I appreciate that.
I'm happy to come out as anti-slavery on the podcast. We're one of the first explicitly anti-slavery podcasts.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're concerned about Father Wesley's anti-slavery convictions, please feel free to contact us. We'd be happy to explain to you why he's right.
That's right. So anyways, I think that's the heart of Marx's critique. Of course, he's coming from that kind of German, late 19th century approach that, religion is anthropology more than it is the actual study of transcendent truths. But there's some aspects in which Christians have treated religion that way. My religion's just about American Jesus and me, and it's like that is Americanism. Our Christianity kind of reflects that sometimes. And so insofar as Marx is is making his critique against that form of religion. I think there's actually a lot we could commend in it. When people look to religion as, perhaps we could say, as a way of excusing suffering or injustice, that is when it becomes bad. Of course, the problem Marx sees here is that religion soothes the pain, but it doesn't actually change the root cause.
Yeah.
So it's just a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
And it can be certain forms of, I mean, think about prosperity preachers. Oh, you're on a fixed income, you're struggling. Here, send me, $100 and it's going to return to you tenfold. That kind of thinking. It does make, it's supposed to make people feel good. But that's not really the call of the cross either. And so, is that a just view of religion? No, but is it true that religion can often be used to perpetuate injustice? Absolutely. And that's not good.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's right. Well, there's a lot to be said about this discussion of communism and capitalism and the communist critique and what they offer in exchange and whatnot. And we could kind of go on forever, but I think we need to, at this point, recommend to our readers.
we do one more listener question.
Oh yes, there's another one. That's right.
We had one more. So Michael on the Substack said, did Marx really think or want people to use his ideas to form a political system beyond a system of economics? And this is a good question. And what he has in mind, I think, and I clarified with him a little bit just to make sure we were on the same page, is like, you often hear the term cultural Marxism to refer to ideologies that are woke.
Yeah.
And so, is that what Marx intended? And on the one hand, the answer to the question is yes, that Marx's system goes beyond pure economics and will absolutely change a political system from the inside out. Does it mean the kind of things that get characterized as woke today? I don't think so. So like, I think let's take something like gender ideology for a moment. There's a proliferation of gendered identities, right?
Yeah.
And sexualities and things like that. Kind of beside the question of what we actually think about those things, I would read that at the proliferation of those identities as a kind of corporatizing of sexuality, right? We've created markets so that people can, during Pride Month, you wear, these kinds of shirts with these colors on them, and we write these kind of books and all these kind of products that get produced because we have now all these identities we have to cater to.
Yeah, I think that's right, because I think what Marx would say about that whole economy of gender identities is it's an expression of the fact that the only relations that hold between man and man are self-interest. It's I identify as this, and I want you to interact with me in this way, pronouns, sexually, whatever that looks like. And it becomes a path for me to find the other people who can give me the transaction that I'm looking for sexually. I think that's how Marx would criticize it. And so I don't think that it's the notion that wokeism is a specific application of Marx. If it is, it's a very clumsy application of Marx. Marx is quite a bit more subtle than that. Remember, guys, one thing, if you take away one thing from this discussion, it is that Marx was brilliant. He was a brilliant, brilliant philosopher. Now, many brilliant philosophers have said some really, really wrong and bad things over time. Dare I suggest Nietzsche? That doesn't change the fact that they're brilliant. And that means that they have to be read with some subtlety, because they are bringing what they're saying is subtle, and they shouldn't be reduced into sort of brute terms. This guy's worth listening to. You have to listen very, very critically.
Yes, absolutely. There's some good New Polity, which is a magazine out of Steubenville, Ohio, very enmeshed in the Catholic social teaching tradition, did a great series of podcasts on gender in a sort of capitalist world. And they go a lot further than what I just did in talking about various identities. I mean, even the sort of sexual revolution was a way of capital creating a larger workforce to enter into for creating more laborers, right? Because now, like, women don't work at home, they work in an office, and we take away the rate at which they had children, and so they're not all these things you can read as sort of capitalistic innovations rather than social Marxism.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something to be said for that. I think if you want someone who would be a good look in contemporary ways at how Marxism might influence politics, would be Slavoj Žižek, who is very critical of he is a leftist, but he's very critical of wokeism type stuff, and would be just as critical of what most people label cultural Marxism as the next guy. So anyways, that might be one place to work. But it's also certainly true that capitalism has impacted so much of our social reality, according to Marx, that to take away capitalism would be to change those things. So all of this would look, what does the family look like in a world outside of capitalism? It's hard to really even say, but it would be different than the current family.
That's right.
So yes, I think that's good. Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Junius?
No, I think that's covered really well. Yeah.
Good. Well, then let's do our end notes. You've got a good one.
So my end note is G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday. And what's the reason I picked this end note is that the backdrop to this is that anarchists are sweeping all over Europe, and there's a feeling that they're everywhere, and wherever you go, there's anarchists throwing bombs and whatnot. And so the plot begins with these policemen who are trying to, in an unorthodox way, ferret out these anarchists and figure out who they are. And that whole situation is exactly what Marx and Engels are describing in the opening to the manifesto, that really gives you a feel for what the air in Europe was like. Oh, there's Marxists, there's communists, everywhere. And we don't know exactly what they believe or what they're doing, but they're everywhere and they're bad and they're going to blow everything up. So I think it's a really good way to get that flavor. And then it just is also a delightful novel in its own right that you can enjoy for the rest of the book.
Nice. I must confess I've not read it.
Oh, dude, I
have a complicated relationship with Chesterton.
Get over it.
Hard. I know.
No, I'm jealous. It's a great read, and I'm excited that you get to read it for the first time now.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so
you
I have
1
few.
year, and then I'm going to put it on next year if you don't read it by then. So
okay. Well, that might be the way to get me to read it. I've got so much to read. Okay, so I have a few in notes. The first is The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction by Walter Benjamin.
So good.
Which is a great essay about art in a capitalist world, and it is a good example. So if you are wondering what Marxist analysis looks like, Benjamin's is really a good example of it. And I think in terms of arguments from Marxists that I've read, it is one that resonates quite a bit, I think. So that's a good book. Another one is Why Marx Was Right by Terry Eagleton. And I want to caveat this by saying I don't think Marx was right in an unqualified way, and Terry Eagleton doesn't either. But the book is meant to sort of kind of do what we're trying to do in this conversation, which is actually look at what Marx thought and what he wanted. So before we started recording, I quoted a part to Junius that for Marx, like the idea of human flourishing isn't you stand in line in a queue to get toilet paper wearing the same uniform as everybody else in the line with just a different number, but rather it's reading Homer on a sunny day, sitting under a tree, eating a peach. It's about leisure. It's about having time to pursue what you love and enjoy. But let me just read this from the preface. I think this is helpful. Eagleton says, "This is not to suggest that Marx never put a foot wrong. I am not of that leftist breed that piously proclaims that everything is open to criticism and then, when asked to produce 3 major criticisms of Marx, lapses into truculent silence. That I have my own doubts about some of his ideas should be clear enough from this book. But he was right enough of the time about enough important issues to make calling oneself a Marxist a reasonable self-description. No Freudian imagines that Freud never blundered, just as no fan of Alfred Hitchcock defends the master's every shot and line of screenplay. I am out to present Marx's ideas not as perfect, but as plausible. To demonstrate this, I take in this book 10 of the most standard criticisms of Marx in no particular order of importance and try to refute them one by one. In the process, I also aim to provide a clear, accessible introduction to his thought for those unfamiliar with his work. And so I think that's a helpful place. Like if you want to have a conversation about what Marx actually says, Eagleton is a great place to check out. Now, the final thing I would say is that all of this should be corrected by the Catholic Teaching Social Collection by Word on Fire, which is a great compilation of documents from the Roman Catholic Church that touch on these issues. So the Catholic Church actually has carved out a very interesting position where it's not really crazy about capitalism, at least in the way it's currently arranged, but it's also not, it doesn't go as far as Marx would go in wanting to overthrow the state and, of course, not wanting to overthrow the church. So Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII, Quadragesimo Anno by Pope Pius XI, a couple other encyclicals, all that. But it's a great little book and a reader if you're not familiar with how the Catholic Church has oriented itself towards these questions. I think that's one of the best places to go. So
very cool.
Yes. All right. Well, listeners, thank you for putting up with us as we have mused about the coming revolution. We hope we'll see you next time. We will be doing the Castle of Otranto. Is that how you say it?
Yes.
I'm excited about it because I've not even really heard of it before you put it on the list. So I can't wait to read it.
I can't wait to hear your response. I'm looking forward to rereading it myself.
Very good. Well, then we will see you next month. And listeners, keep on reading.